Well, it's reached 12:30, so we might make a start. My name's Joanne Smedley, and I'm a curator in the Photographs, Film and Sound team at the Australian War Memorial, and it's my pleasure today to talk to you about some of the nurses' collections that are held in the memorial and how they sit within the professional studio photography kind of area. Nurses were really no different to their male counterparts, many of whom had cameras. Many nurses did too, and a lot of people were quite keen devotees of amateur photography. Daniel Palmer writes in the La Trobe Journal in 2005 that the contribution of women photographers to the early history of Australian fashion photography is quite significant. With the increasing aspiration of photographers to the status of artist, women's achievements have been a little bit marginalised. Women's photographers had a central role in the development of fashion photography and sit within that context of simultaneous democratisation and rarefication of photographic practice in the context of the Australian pictorial movement. And he was referring to the rise of amateur photography in the wake of the Kodak Revolution. Photographic journals that began to appear toward the end of the 19th century were often supportive of women photographers operating professionally. And many writers have identified the practice of amateur photography that was systematically pitched at women from the 1890s. And this advertisement shows the well-known image of the Kodak Girl, which is quite lovely on a number of levels. It certainly aimed to colonise the new leisure time of the fashionable middle-class woman with her free-flowing dress and newfound mobility in Australia. As in other Western nations, she embodied the new woman, the relatively financially independent woman. It's into this sphere that I think the nurses fit quite nicely. These are two examples from the work of Mei and Moore. They were professional photographers who were born in New Zealand but emigrated to Australia before the First World War. They marketed themselves quite brilliantly as photographers and carved a niche in theatre and soldier portraiture. It built on their reputation in both Sydney and Melbourne, where they operated studios separately but functioned under both names. If you note the artist palette, which is used as Mei Moore's logo, I think really draws that connection between art and photography there very nicely. Their particular style was described as the Rembrandt style, which was the sort of photographs that featured with a dark background, a single light, often a profile, and quite aesthetically beautiful. They advertised in the Lone Hand magazine and featured on a number of covers during the First World War. I would say the Kodak Girl did inspire many women to take photographs, and in the thirst for Australian images and content, many Australian newspapers and weeklies sought content taken by nurses as well as by soldiers. And some of these photographs from our collection, very often there's a camera in someone's hand. Obviously there's another camera taking the photograph, so potentially they had multiple images being taken, swapping cameras. Staff nurse J. Millicent Kennedy of Maryborough, Victoria, wrote a very chatty letter home that was published in the Maryborough and Denali Advertiser in March 1916. She's talking about taking photographs of some of the sights that she had seen while she was over in Egypt. I would love a snap of goats climbing a ladder into a house, and when I get that camera, I have promised myself some things are in view. At present, it's impossible to get Kodak film in Cairo, and the girls here are sending home for them. Some of the camera fiends have beautiful collections, so it's obviously quite an established practice. A lot of the photographs that we have show nurses in leisure time, but also nurses at work, and I think it gives us some insight into that experience that they had. Not a patient to be seen there, but she's busy at the desk. The providers, businesses that sold cameras had a bit of a field day working out that they could market themselves to soldiers. They didn't market themselves to nurses per se, but many nurses nonetheless took advantage and either bought a camera or took theirs with them. And these are just some of the examples of Harrington's and Kodak just advertising the types of cameras that they had and how suitable they were and how easy to use. So making it a very accessible practice. After the war, pictures of life in the trenches, exciting charges, types of prisoners captured, and 1,001 other things will be of the greatest value to returned soldiers. It is splendidly adapted to active service usage, strong, easy to use, nothing to get out of order. There's at least 4 cameras, I think, in that front row. So publishing images sent back by soldiers and nurses was also a popular way for papers to get content and inform their Australian audiences. Weekly journals such as the Sydney Mail had a regular feature page, snapshots by soldiers, nurses and sailors. It's an easy way to get some content, but also sort of connect people back home with activities which were more informal and less officially constructed in terms of the photography. This is a little bit indistinct, but it's sort of showing some photographs taken by a nurse, not named, where they, I guess, were taking photographs of things that were different and unusual to them, and it's a way of reminding themselves when they came back home, but also to send to their families so that they could experience through the photographs what they were experiencing themselves. And of course, these have a wider audience being published in papers such as the Sydney Mail. So one of the things that is quite interesting, there are also professional photographers who found their way into the first AIF. Albert Savage was one who joined up, or he applied to enlist in the first AIF, and he initially was not allowed to enlist because he had poor eyesight, which I think is quite an interesting thing for a photographer. But nonetheless, he got a special dispensation to enlist, and he actually ended up having a lovely sideline. He was assigned to the X-ray department of No. 3 Australian General Hospital, and that hospital was based on Lemnos Island, and it was set up to deal with casualties coming back from Gallipoli. He had a lovely role as camp photographer as well as his work in the X-ray department. And Evelyn Davies, a nursing sister, also was at that hospital. So it's quite interesting to sort of have a look at both Albert's images and then the things that Evelyn also took. Sister Davies was born at Hillsville in Victoria, and she trained for 3 years at Geelong Hospital, where she qualified before her enlistment in May 1915. And she embarked with members of the 3rd Australian General Hospital on the Multan, which is a transport ship, and served on Lemnos and with the 3rd Australian General Hospital until July 1916, when she was transferred to the Indian Medical Service, and then by 1918 and 19 she was serving back in England. So this little trio of images, I think, just gives some insight into the types of images that nurses took. People who enlist in the first AIF are tourists as much as people there to do a job. And I think very often their private photographs are a great insight into the things that they got up to in their downtime, but also photographs to remind themselves of their friends and perhaps also take their mind off other things that they were seeing and working with. I particularly love the 4 nurses who climbed the pyramids in their skirts. I can't imagine how difficult and awkward that must have been. but luckily had a camera with them to actually have that recorded while they were there. And this is that same photograph with the tree pasted into an album. And the caption's "The Solitary Tree on Mudros." And of course, there's a camera case just in the bottom right-hand corner of the image on the right there. So cameras always carried with them, always at the ready. And Sister Davies returned to Australia in May 1919 and arrived in her hometown of Healesville, where she was greeted by a large crowd. They'd gathered at the local railway station to welcome her home and present her with flowers. She was discharged from the AIF in January 1920. In the 1920s, she moved to Christchurch to live and died there in 1966. I think the thing that strikes me with all these images is how informal and friendly the subjects are. She does have some very interesting photographs further on in the album, and sort of at first instance, I guess the impression here is of cold, which of course it was, so much so that if you notice just at the bottom of the coat, the nurses are actually wearing puttees and trousers, which is certainly something that was not part of their uniform and wouldn't have probably been taken by any kind of official photographer. So it's rather nice that in snapshots in her album we actually have a little insight into women wearing something entirely practical to assist with the conditions that they were working under. The hospital on Lemnos was a tented hospital, so I can't imagine it was terribly wind, rain and weatherproof. So it's rather nice to see some evidence of things that I had seen in letters where they described wearing the puttees and wearing the trousers, to actually see the evidence in these photos. They certainly give an insight into the conditions, and still smiling. Now, Bessie Pocock was a well-known nurse who served in both the Boer War and the First World War. And at the time this photograph was taken, it was close to the end of the First World War, and she was aged 59, which I think is a considerable age for the work that she will have been undertaking through both the Boer War and the First World War, where conditions were never easy. Now we have Bessie's collection, and it's sort of gradually being released onto our website. She was born in 1863 in Dalby in Queensland. Her name was Anne Mary Pocock, but she was known as Bessie. And she worked as a domestic servant in Grafton, where she had moved to with her family. And following the death of her fiancé, she commenced nursing training at the Sydney Hospital when she was 27. So on completion, she joined that hospital staff. In 1899, she joined the New South Wales Army Service Reserve and was one of 14 nurses led by matron Nellie Gould to serve in South Africa. They arrived in 1900 and she was posted to No. 2 British Stationary Hospital there. It was housed in an old agricultural show building where conditions were primitive. In her diary wrote, "Just 3 huge rooms, 2 with boards on the floor. We had about 500 patients in a very little time. It was very hot here. The buildings all covered with corrugated iron, flies very bad. Everyone required mosquito nets." She went on to serve close to the front in Johannesburg and then Middlesbrough in the Transvaal, where she was sister in charge. And she treated wounded and ill soldiers herself until she herself contracted typhoid, and then she was invalided to Britain. She was there in time to attend the coronation procession in London in August 1902. She returned to Australia in 1903 and then was one of the Boer War nurses who joined the Australian Army Nursing Service Reserve in the lead up to the First World War. She again enlisted, serving with No. 2 Australian General Hospital, serving in Cairo, Ismailia, and also becoming matron on a hospital ship, the SA, off Gallipoli. when she arrived back in Australia in 1919, she returned to her role as matron at the Gladesville Hospital in Sydney, and then she opened a private hospital called Ismailia, which is the name of a place in Egypt as well where she was. And that hospital, or private hospital, was in Chatswood in Sydney. And she was a very active member of the Australasian Trained Nurses Association all her life. So her collection was not taken by her because the formats are all different sizes, different information, the inscriptions on the back. She's often written captions for them, but they've clearly been given to her by other people. And like a lot of nurses, if she didn't have her own camera, they would often acquire prints from another source. And this is an example of one of the prints that she would have been given, showing the nurses in England at dining. Very typical in nurses' collections is also to have photographs of your patients, sometimes sent to, in grateful thanks back to the nurse in question, and sometimes to actually record the medical treatment or the medical setup, which I think is the top example with a guy with a very heavily bandaged leg. This is another photograph in her collection that's her quite happily having her photograph taken next to Billy Hughes. And I think when you look at you can see the condition of that photograph. It was obviously a much treasured photograph in her collection. And this is her in later life, taken by a street photographer. I think the upright lady we saw back in the First World War is still there in this image. This is taken on Anzac Day, and she died in 1946. Ada Smith, we don't know too much about Ada, but her collection is really quite lovely. And Ada Smith was born in Warwick in Queensland in 1887, and she was 29 years old when she enlisted, and she served in the No. 2 Australian General Hospital and No. 2 Australian Casualty Clearing Station. Ada's album this is the fly page, which I think is again quite lovely. And her collection is a really lovely mix of formal and informal. And she definitely took a lot of these photographs, well, obviously not the ones of her, but the ones that are in the album. And it's a really gentle insight, I think, into her experience. She enlisted in 1916 and served both in Egypt and also in France. And the photo on the left is in France, the photo on the right is taken in Egypt. And it's probably one of those really lovely, rare photographs. I mean, she's got her hair down, she's got a lovely embroidered dressing gown on, and it's definitely the sort of photograph that you take for your family or you take for your friends, or you take when you're practicing your photography. So I think between her and her friends, they recorded lots of these private sort of moments. Some other pages in the album also show her being a tourist and having walks with friends, sites around Egypt. And then other pages that show her in her tent, the wards, outdoor patient treatment, and a photograph of her sort of set up in her bedroom, which I think is quite gentle as well. Those touches of home with a lovely quilt. I think the camera's just on the bed behind her. And the same dressing gown that was in another photograph back in Egypt has obviously travelled with her to France as well, the checked dressing gown behind her. She returned to Australia in 1919 and was discharged as medically unfit in June 1920. In 1927 she married and she died in Queensland in 1973. So we don't know too much else about her life. But I do think the album provides us with some lovely context for her experience. I think some of the most interesting photographs of nurses in their downtime are in this album. She was great friends with Mary Jane Dara, who was later awarded a military medal, and that's Mary Jane Dara, just in the bottom left there, with the very long plaits. So the last collection I'm going to talk about is matron Ethel Gray. She was a much beloved figure. She was born in 1876 in Carlton in Victoria, and in 1915 she volunteered for the Australian Army Nursing Service and was asked to take charge of a convalescent depot for Australian troops in England. So she arrived 10 days after her, she embarked 10 days after her enlistment, and on reaching England she discovered that the hospital, which was Harefield Park House in Middlesex, was not ready for occupation. So she had to basically set up this hospital from scratch. It was a house which had been given up for use as a hospital, and her collection I don't think was taken by her either, but she's been given many photographs over her period of service, both in England and later on in Wimereux in France, where she went on to be matron at No. 2 Australian General Hospital when it moved to France. The 6 or so albums that we have of her collection really give a great insight into her experience. They range from the formal to the informal. Sometimes it's the captions, I think, that actually make the image quite meaningful. I'll just read them out because I don't think you can read them. On the roof of the sick nurse's room at Harefield, Sister Ripper, best name ever, who is nursing Sister Mills. So it's a lovely little insight into two women she clearly worked closely with. And on the bottom, the caption written underneath and in quotes is, "Matron, look how small these pyjamas are." So 2 blokes are in one pair of pyjamas there, in case you couldn't work that out. They're a complete sort of random mix of images, some showing people that she met in the course of her work, and others. There's obviously a convalescent patient in a basket chair there, and her caption underneath is "taken at my office window." So it's, I think, while not organised in any kind of date or subject sense, they really are, again, a wonderful insight into her as a person. So in many collections, images appear that actually connect those stories, and Ada Smith's, whose collection I've already mentioned, actually snapped a shot of the matron when she was working at No. 2 Australian General Hospital, where the matron had come to in late 1917. And Ada's caption is quite charming and simple: "Matron Gray, a lovable person." It's not particularly well composed, but, you know, it's snapped in the moment, and that's what I think makes it quite charming. So while this talk has focused on sort of First World War nurses, clearly this wasn't just restricted to this phenomenon of people taking photographs and recording memories, wasn't restricted just to the First World War, and I probably will develop this talk a little bit further to talk about other conflicts as well. But in a short space of time, it's a little bit hard to kind of come to do a great sort of story on nurses and the cameras and the stories that they tell. So I thought by highlighting 3 collections, I would actually allow just some private insights and perspectives on service that you might not otherwise know through having individual items showing up on our website. When you have a look at the pages that the images are taken from, I think you get some very different insights into the personalities of the people who either took them or collected them. And those images that the nurses themselves would have intended as very private things to share with both their friends and family have, of course, now a much wider audience because they're part of the memorials collection. And I think it can be quite a privilege to be able to tell those stories through the collection items. So thank you for your time and hope you've enjoyed this. Are there any questions? Yes?
I think it was Bessie Pocock. There's and the photo with Billy Hughes. Do you know who the little girl was?
I think it was his daughter or his daughter's daughter. It might have been his granddaughter. The family was with him. Sorry, should have checked that out. But yes, there's a photograph of him coming back on ship, I think, with the same little girl.
So it was his and not one of the nurses?
No, although there was a nurse who did have a baby. That's another story.
So just, were they mostly single women then, or did some have families and children?
The nurses were supposed to be single women. The nurse that I just mentioned who had a baby, her husband, she actually enlisted under her maiden name, but she listed him as her next of kin on her embarkation. And she was pregnant at the time she actually embarked with the No. 3 Australian General Hospital, and was Colonel Fiaschi's wife. Anyway, she had the baby over in Egypt. And another nurse who was with No. 3 AGH stayed to look after her while she had the baby. She wasn't allowed to go off to Lemnos, which apparently the Colonel was upset about, but I think, given the conditions, I think it was probably a good thing. Anyway, that's another story, really.
Jo, just in terms of nurses' pay, how expensive was it for them to actually purchase the camera? What's the ratio?
Sorry, I don't really have that, but I think it was clearly accessible because so many of them had cameras. And I think we're probably talking at a time too when people didn't have so much in the way of property, or possessions, and there was a lot of encouragement of people to do their own developing. I think the condition of some of the photographs indicates to me that they probably did their own developing as well, because they're not completely I think in Ada Smith's you can see how sort of soft they are, and I think they just haven't been quite fixed properly with chemicals. So I think they potentially did those themselves. I don't think they took them to a studio in Cairo and had them developed there, which a lot of soldiers did. So, and there are lots of the photographic journals of the day would tell people, give instructions about how to do that. And I think it was a really sort of wide-reaching kind of hobby for a lot of people as well. So, yeah. Well, if there's nothing further, I'll thank you again. Thank you.